opening chapters of Hegel's phenomenology, the object of perception had replaced an earlier candidate for, as it were, a conception of independent objecthood that Hegel discusses in the chapter Sense Certainty. The purported object of sense certainty had the sort of singularity and immediacy that we attribute to things of direct demonstrative reference, as conceived as some pure this, something like an Aristotelian proper sensible, or perhaps in more modern terms a Russellian sense datum. But the sense certaintist had, or is supposed to have learnt, that the only way a thought about a this could be made determinate was by invoking a contrast with some contrasting that. With the idea of sense certainty, what Hegel seems to mean is an epistemology and ontology, something like that found in the pre-Socratics. As Geoffrey Lloyd has pointed out, the cosmological fragments of the pre-Socratics are pervaded by pairs of opposed terms, such as hot and cold, wet and dry, and so on, that are loosely linked in sorts of analogical series. Aristotle had attributed the doctrine that most things go in pairs to Akmaion, and had linked the idea of the table of opposites to the Pythagoreans. But while taking over such opposed conceptual pairs, Aristotle had radically reconceived their ontological significance. While pre-Socratics had conceived of qualities as sort of quasi-objects, perhaps something like abstract particulars or tropes, as discussed now, transmuting into their opposites. For Aristotle, an object was no bundle of such things, no bundle of such sort of property things, as even Plato had seemed to believe, but an underlying substance. In his mature metaphysics, a particularised form in which the properties inhere. So, quoting Aristotle, one and the same individual, he says, is at one time white, warm and good, and at another time black, old or bad. Right? I mean, so the pre-Socratic sort of images of the world is made up of those sort of qualities being bundled up in sort of individuals, where Aristotle's trying to find some sort of enduring identity for the individual underlying them. That is, it is just the transformed version of pre-Socratic contraries that turn up in Aristotle's conception of the individual substance, which can instantiate contrary qualities at different times, but not at the same time. The role played by opposed contraries in Aristotle's idea of perception actually fits nicely with the account of the physiological basis he gives to sense perception in De Anima. And that's a work that Hegel was very receptive to. Sense perception is a faculty humans share with other animals, according to Aristotle, and it's limited to the cognition of particulars, while beliefs involving explicit affirmation or denial presuppose a grasp of universals and are restricted to humans. This much interpreters are agreed about. But considerable controversy accompanies the issue of whether Aristotle affords a type of conceptual content to the experience that is had on the basis of sense perception alone. Now, somewhat like Bob Brandom, Aristotle portrays sense perception as a capacity for the organism by which it's capable of reliable discriminatory responses to objects. Each sense organ is such that it can respond to common sensibles of a certain type, colours for the eye, sounds for the ear, and so on. The response of the organ being to take on the form of its object without any accompanying matter. By this, Aristotle seems to mean that the sense organ actually takes on the property of the object perceived. The transparent fluid of the eye, for example, he thinks of actually becoming red in the visual perception of red objects. But that detail is not necessary. Any constant correlation between the properties of the perceived objects here and the properties of the sort of relevant part of the sense organ would presumably suffice for Aristotle. A further feature of the response of the sense organ is important, however, in that the range of properties responded to will be arrayed along a continuum at the end of which stand opposed extremes, with the resting state of the organ somehow located between those extremes. Thus, the eye will respond to a range of colours, the extremes of which are black at one end and white at the other, while its resting state will be neither black nor white. Well, it will be transparent in Aristotle's account. Aristotle, then, might be described as an early advocate of what's now known as an opponent processing approach to perception. As mentioned before, Considerable controversy surrounds the interpretative issue as to whether conceptual content can be ascribed to perceptual experience on Aristotle's model. At one end of this interpretive sort of debate stand people like Charles Kahn, for example, who ascribes only Brandomian types of reliable discriminatory responses to sense perception on Aristotle's model. Aristotle actually comes out somewhat similar to sort of Bob's position on that. While a dog can discriminate his master from his master's horse, it would be misleading, Kahn claims, to say that the dog perceives his master as his master. Others, however, point out that this view of Aristotelian sense perception can accommodate neither what Aristotle calls incidental perception, perceptions such as, the example that he gives, this white thing is the son of Darius, and he treats that as a perceptual content, not as a belief, nor can it account for Aristotle's approach to induction. Such considerations, they argue, suggest that Aristotle is committed to a view of perception as having some kind of predicative or even propositional content. I think it's very misleading to put it like that, but a content quite different to that of belief or one associated with inferential reasoning. Richard Srabji is one person who's sort of most, I suppose, prominent in that type of interpretation. At this, as it were, non-Brandomian end of the interpretative spectrum, then, Aristotle has an account of perception that affords conceptual content to the perceptual experience of even some non-human animals. He exempts worms, I think, but he includes ants and bees. For them, we might say, perception provides, for these interpreters, perception provides an original intentional content that is only then expressed in the language of language-using rational animals like ourselves. What's important for us, however, is not Aristotle's actual account of perception. As I said, there's not general agreement on how to read it, but Hegel's. Brandom's thesis that Hegel has an inferentialist theory of conceptual content seems to me to be right. So Hegel could not ascribe to perceptual experience any idea of an original conceptual content which could then be used to account for the semantic content of our expressed perceptual judgments. In fact, something like this characterises the assumption that he examines in the Phenomenology of Spirit as perception, because in his story the objective perception is equally fated to break down as a model of objecthood and be replaced by another conception, just as had the object of sense certainty, as it were, been shown to be inadequate. What replaces the perceptual object as the criterion of independent reality in Hegel's story is the object of the understanding. Roughly, the object of the modern scientific view, something like the Newtonian world as understood by Kant, a dynamically interacting totality of mutually affecting forces of attraction and repulsion, the overall behaviour of which can be understood in terms of universal laws. I mean, that's not where the story stops, of course, in Hegel, but that's the part that I want to concentrate on here. Moreover, I want to suggest that the logical categories structuring this world, the world of the understanding, will fit more a propositional logic than a term logic. The transformation of these categories, Hegel thinks, will be somehow driven by reflective experience itself. We can see how this might come about, I think, by reflecting on the circumstances in which a pair of contrary propositions could be transformed into a pair of contradictory ones. And this happens in contexts of epistemic opposition or dialectical contestation. In a dialectical situation, a particular immediate claim on the part of one subject, let's say this A is F, will be met with opposition if, from the point of view of some other subject, this A is experienced as having some other incompatible or contrary quality, its being non-F, and if the opponent thinks of themselves as justified in and on behalf of that experience. Let's say Agathon's immediate perceptual response to Socrates' appearance is describe him as ugly, while Alcibiades describes him as beautiful. When Agathon's opposing position is expressed in relation to that of Alcibiades, that is, as a mediated rather than a type of immediate claim, Agathon's counterclaim will be put as a denial. So Socrates is beautiful will be now met with claims like Socrates is not beautiful. And this will of course apply to Alcibiades too. He's likely to say things like Socrates is not ugly. In this context then,